Şimdi keynote konuşmamızı, ilk konuşmamızı yapmak üzere Massimo'yu buraya davet ediyorum. Kendisi AWS'te Director of Product Management. Massimo, I'd like to invite you to, to give your keynote.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. This is usually the most embarrassing moment. All right. I don't have any sound, so if that is. So thanks for having me. Thanks to all the organizers. Thanks for all the sponsors as well, without which this event could not happen. My name is Massimo Re Ferre. I'm part of the product management team at AWS that works on a part of this generative AI story. I work for an organization that is called Next Generation Developer Experience. Think about Amazon Q, right, in terms of the product that we build. As I said, this is usually the most embarrassing moment because usually things. Okay, cool. So that's me. To the point that I was trying to make, generative AI is a big space, right? It's disrupting a lot of industry and places, and what I'm going to talk about for the next 35, 40 minutes is mostly my day-by-day experience with generative AI, right? So do not expect me to talk about how generative AI is disrupting Hollywood or other things that pertain to generative AI, but this is not like the topic of this talk. Just a little bit about me. I have gray hairs. I've been in the industry for a very long time, like 30 years, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a roundup of what I've been doing. So I started actually at IBM. I never really worked on the mainframe, but I usually think of mainframe as my very first technology wave, #1 that I was exposed to. As I said, I never really worked on the mainframe because I started at IBM on these, what we call the personal computer, right? Like this device that was like getting so much attention in the industry. And I spent the vast majority of my time working on this technology wave, right? And what I did is that I started working on the abstraction on top of these technology waves. So I started working on servers based on these x86 chip, which is what we usually use on a daily basis. And then I started working on virtual machines, which is an abstraction on top of those servers. I moved into the container space. I consider still that like part of that technology wave because I see that more of an abstraction of that computer that sits underneath. And this was the point where I started my transition from what I refer like the traditional data center delivery model to the cloud delivery model, right? So I started to look more into how does these technologies can be fulfilled through a different delivery model, like in the cloud. And then I moved into another set of abstractions that are functions. A year and a half ago, I made the transition to what I think is going to be like a very brand new technology wave, which is generative AI, right? So this is how my career is kind of panning out. One thing that I want to point out in these, and I see a lot of young faces, I want to suggest that when you are going to transition into new things throughout your career, you're probably going to do that in a couple of ways. You're going to do that in using like what I call the wow moment, the moment that you realize that something is really changing in the industry. And there are other ways to transition that are like, you get like to understand over time that this is how things are going to work in the long run. VMs was an example of my transition with a wow moment. I was in the US working with the team building this gigantic 16 CPUs server that at the time was literally gigantic. And they were telling me, look, we built this machine, but nobody wants it, right? Everybody wants this very small Windows server to run very small applications, so we do not know how to sell this gigantic machine. And they said, we're working with this company called VMware. There are like, 10 people, and they built this hypervisor that allows us to chunk this server into many small VMs. I look at them and I said, you must be kidding. I mean, this is never going to work. I mean, you put like a software that slices a machine. I mean, just shut up. I mean, this is not going to work. So they hand out to me the CD because at that time, this is how we were building stuff and deploying stuff. I went back home, I installed it on my server that I had in the office, and my first realization was like, this thing is going to change the world. So that to me was kind of a wow moment. The transition to cloud was more like, what is this thing, right? About, spinning up EC2 instances in the cloud. So it took me many, many months to realize that that transition was actually key. For generative AI, a year and a half ago, the transition that I made was basically through this wow moment. Everybody was talking about this ChatGPT thing, and I was like, what is this thing here, right? And I had actually a problem at stake, right? I was moving my blog on S3, CloudFront, and for whatever reason, I don't even remember it, I had to strip out the www on top of my entire address, and I learned that I could use an edge function to do that, right? So when a request comes in to www.my website, it would strip out the www. So I didn't know how to build that, so I asked ChatGPT, write a lambda at edge function for CloudFront that strips out www in front of a host name if it exists. And boom, I got like that thing. Right? I didn't have to do anything. It just tell me, this is the lambda function that you need to use. And to me, that was like this wow moment of, gosh, this is something here, right? This thing is going to be very, very useful in the long run. I'm digressing a little bit with this slide because it doesn't add too much to the discussion that I'm going to have, but I'm always amazed by how this technology works, how generative AI works. If you peel out everything that you do today, maybe with generative AI, or you heard about generative AI, at the end of the day, what generative AI does is statistically predicting what you want out, right? So one example that I usually use, if you go to a playground, this could be like any generative AI playground, like in Bedrock or wherever, and you type ABCD, just ABCD, and you submit it, what you get is EF and then an explanation. So basically, generative AI is trying to figure out what you want to do, and it's going to fill it with what you want, right? And if you think about all the things that you can do with generative AI, and if you think that it is based on like this very simple concept, it's kind of amazing if you think about that. So why is generative AI such a big deal, right? Why is it so, why is everybody talking about this, right? And the way that I try to think about this is that how do you create a new asset? Like the example of the edge function that I was alluding to before, how do you create a new asset using the knowledge that exists out there? It could be AWS documentation, it could be a bunch of things that exist out there that allows you to learn how to do things so that you can build those assets, right? And an asset could be pretty much everything, like a blog post, a program, or whatever. So if you are there, there are, like, I think about 3 options to do this, right? To create asset out of that knowledge. So the first one is that you read it all and you memorize it so that you know everything on how to build that, right? And of course, this is not possible, right? I mean, you cannot know everything, right? The other way that we have been using, I have been using for a very long time, is search, right? So you search, and then you figure out how you build your asset with the information that that search came out with. But this is still like limited, meaning that you are the integrator of that asset. You need to build that asset, right? So if I go back again to the example of that Lambda function, I could have searched how I build a Lambda function, how I strip out like a particular piece of the host name of my website. I'm still kind of the entity that needs to collect those information and integrate them to build that asset. What generative AI allows you to do is it allows to train like these large language models based on that knowledge, and the big deal out of it is that you can use natural language conversation. You can actually use English or any other language if the model support that, and you let the LLM to create that asset for you, right? I think that these two things are the big deal of generative AI in general. This is my attempt, and it's a little bit of an experiment that I haven't tested, but because generative AI is so pervasive in terms of what we do as builders, right? So around the code, I wanted to create some sort of framework on how to think about all the places where you can use generative AI to smooth your work, right? And the way that I was trying to form this mental model is that there is a program, like everybody's building applications, right? Each of you are building applications, right? And then there is a builder and the user of that application. So the role of these people is that the builder is writing code, right? Mostly in an IDE. The code is a set of functions, right? It's a program, right? It could be Java, it could be Python, it could be whatever. And then there is a user, right, that is actually using that application. Depending on what that application is, it could be clicking on a user interface, or it could use like a query language to extract data, right? This could be a business user extracting data for customers or whatever that application does. So based on what I see like three main patterns of using generative AI in this context. The first one, which is probably the one that we're mostly familiar with, is like letting the end user to use generative AI to deal with the application. Think about like the chatbot, right? Talk to your documentation. These are usually the things that allow the end user to be exposed with generative AI. So maybe instead of running those English queries, those SQL queries, it could run these English queries, like give me the customer that match these particular criteria, instead of writing select from customers where blah, blah, blah, blah, right? So this is what I call generative AI at consumption time. There is another domain that is more around who's writing code. This is what I call the generative AI at development time. So basically the builder, instead of writing code in the IDE and writing a function that does particular things, it could prompt generative AI and the generative AI assistant to say, create a function that does string comparisons, for example, right? And what generative AI does is it turns that prompt into code, pretty much like I did for my Lambda function, and you embed it into the program. The program doesn't change. The program is still a Python, Java program, but the way that that code has been generated is different from the builder actually typing that code. Okay? The third domain, which is very interesting to me, is using generative AI at runtime. If you heard, and probably you heard about this notion of English as the new programming language, that is what it means, right? So instead of writing a piece of code in Python, Java, or any other language, you write your code in English. A couple of examples that I wanted to call out. There is a link here that you cannot see, but if you get the slides, you will see that link. It's a blog post of a user that has been using generative AI, right, to rewrite part of its code to compare addresses, physical addresses. Like imagine you have a list of physical addresses and you need to compare them and extract if one address is exactly the same of the other, but it's written in a very different way, right? As a human being, you can look at two addresses that are written differently, but you can kind of say, well, this is the same address, right? I mean, it's just written in a very different way, but it's the same physical address, right? If you try to do that with a programming language, it's very difficult to do that, right? And extract exactly and making those comparison. The other example that I wanted to use is my own example. My very first generative AI application where I have used English as a programming language is a step function workflow that takes as an input a WhatsApp vocal message. I hate WhatsApp vocal message. So this was my need. I got this WhatsApp vocal message of 5 minutes, and I'm like, there is no way that I'm going to listen to this thing, right? I'm just not going to do this. So I created a step function where I said, use Amazon Transcribe to extract and to transcribe that vocal message into a wall of text, which I did not want to read. And then I use Bedrock to say, just take that as an input and summarize it in a third of the size without losing context. And it worked beautifully, right? It just works, right? So these are a couple of examples where generative AI at runtime can be very useful. Because I said I work more in this space, Amazon Q and generative AI assistant, I wanted to drill in a little bit into that space. These are 4 topics that keep coming up when we talk about generative AI assistance for builders, right? The first one is, where are these assistants going, right? So let's talk about a little bit about what we have seen in the last few months and what the trajectory that we see for this generative AI assistant is. If you have been following along, you know, what's happening in the market, you will realize that what happened is that everything started from this notion of these inline coding suggestions, right? Basically, the idea here is that you are in the IDE, you start typing your code, and the generative AI assistant is going to start suggesting what you want to write. It's pretty much the example that I was using at the beginning, A, B, C, D, and it just responds, well, I guess that you want E, F. And this is doing exactly the same thing. You start typing the name of a function, and we'll start suggesting, I mean, you probably want to write this one, and you accept that suggestion. The second wave that we have seen, and I apologize, you're not supposed to read all of this, but this is basically a chat interface, which has been, as I said, the second wave of this innovation, where you can ask things like, how do I query a DynamoDB table, right? Or how do I use ECS versus EKS? All these sort of things that allows you as a builder to take decision on which service you can use, how you can use those services, and these sort of things. So this is less about inline coding suggestion. This is more like a conversational interface to this generative AI assistant. The wave that we're in right now is the wave of these so-called agents, right? Which are more sophisticated workflows that allows builders like you to abstract a little bit from that iterative chat that I was showing and just give the assistant a task, a goal, right? One of the examples that I usually use, and you cannot read this thing, and you're not supposed to read these things, but this is an example that says, I have an application, it doesn't have a user interface, go build a user interface for this application, right? And of course, this is like a super higher level abstraction compared to inline coding suggestion or a chat interface. And the reason why I'm showing this picture here, not because you have to read it, but because it splits into different phases, which is what the agents usually do. So when you prompt these inside this generative AI assistant, what it does is it comes up with a plan, right? Basically, it's going to say, okay, you're asking me to do this thing. I think that you want me to do all this stuff here. It's an additional level of details that take the prompt and says, based on the prompt, I'm going to do all these things. The funny thing is that for many customers, the plan is all they need. They just need guidance in terms of what should I do if I want to build a UI for this application, right? And they stop here. They take the plan and they go out and start building that user interface. But these agents allow you to click a button and say, generate the code off of this plan. So the assistant is actually going to generate the code for you based on the initial prompt. Okay? So this is kind of the wave. There is one thing that not a lot of people talk about, but I think that it's very, very important, and you will see people talking more about this thing, which is this notion of from English to code to English. All the discussions around the generative AI assistant is, I want to prompt in English, and I want a piece of code. Like, this is what I refer to English to code. There is a set of use cases for which the reverse is very important. Like, here is a piece of code, tell me what it does. But it's not as simple as that. It could be, here is a repository, tell me what it does. Tell me how I can onboard easily into this repository. What a lot of customers are telling us is that one of the most challenging things that they are seeing in the engineering team is how do you onboard people into a project. They spend a lot of time getting used to that code base, understanding that code base before they can become productive. The people that are using this assistant are telling us that one of the killer use cases is to allow these engineers to extract like the meaning of the code that they need to work on. So I just documented a few examples of these in a blog post that I wrote a few months ago, where I was, for example, rewriting a README file. So you can say, using those agents, you can say, rewrite me this README file for that folder and explain to me exactly what that folder contains in terms of the code that it contains, right? This is the first example. The other example is, of course, builders and developers hate writing documentation. So imagine using this assistant to say, go through all my functions and document them with the 3-line comments about what they do. So you as a builder, you as a developer, you just write your function, and then you use the generative AI assistant to document that function on your behalf. Right? This is a very interesting use case that we have seen a lot of customers being very interested in. Another very interesting thing is, how do I measure productivity for these things? This may not be very relevant for the single developer, but think about organizations, right? Big organizations that are paying for this assistant, and they keep constantly wondering, am I paying, right for these assistants? Are they useful to our organization? How do we track that these assistants are money that are well spent inside the organization? And there are many ways that they can do this. One is inside their organization, and I'm talking about specifically about Q here. They get like statistics in terms of how the builders accepted those suggestions, for example, right? So this is kind of useful because it doesn't require end user feedback, right? It's just part of the system to track those things. But we don't know if it's the right thing to track to claim productivity, right? So there are other mechanisms that organizations are using for these, which is, for example, asking the user to do thumbs up, thumbs down for answers that they're getting. This is a useful proxy. This is definitely a very direct proxy to being useful, but the point is that it requires explicit feedback from the user, right? And the user not always kind of click on thumbs up, thumbs down. The other thing that we end up doing is we ask builders to fill out surveys, right? Which is another mechanism to ask them, was this thing useful to you or not? I think that one of the things that is very, very interesting and very useful to track is this time to get the job done. This is a part of Equip that we use for internal user studies, where we track the time that it takes to do certain things. The time that it takes to write a README, the time that it takes to write infrastructure code, the time that it takes to do a bunch of other things. And this seems to be like a good proxy to productivity, right? Because if without a generative AI assistant, it takes me an hour to do something, and with the generative AI assistant, it takes me 5 minutes, it's kind of a good productivity gain. What we have seen, though, is that, and this is kind of a funny thing, is that we are seeing signal of customers wondering if this is the right signal, right? So I've seen this tweet a few months ago from someone saying that I heard that people using Copilot GitHub are lamenting, or the organization that are using GitHub Copilot are lamenting that the users just, want to do less, and that's it. And I thought, I mean, this is a little bit of an extreme thing. And then I was talking to a colleague a few weeks ago, and he was saying the same thing. He was saying, the customers see developers wanting to use this tool to complete their existing tasks faster and get off work early, which to me was like, kind of, yeah, this is pretty much what you want them to do. Or, depending on how you are organized, you may want to have to take the other task, right, the next task in their pipeline, right? But I think that, mission accomplished, I would say, in this case. What you do with that time left, I mean, it's pretty much up to you. The other topic that keeps coming up when we talk about this generative AI assistant is, can you trust them, right? I mean, it's, hallucinations and all these things. So this is a very typical statement that we hear on a daily basis, right? How can you trust a generative AI assistant? How can you make sure it's not hallucinating, right? You need to verify every answer and every artifact that it gives you, which is maybe true. But if I go back, and as I said, I have gray hairs, right? I've seen some of these patterns. If I go back 20 plus years, these are exactly the same thing that we were hearing when we were talking about VMs. How can you trust a VM? How can you know that the bug is in the hypervisor and it's not in the application, right? I mean, this is history repeating, so to speak, right? So my question is, do you trust everything and everyone, right? I mean, can you trust consultants, solutions architect, TAMs, me? If you ask my wife, she will say, do not trust him, right? And she's right, because the other anecdote that I usually use is the very first hallucination that I've seen personally was in 1995. I was working with a customer next to him on one of those big boxes that I was alluding to, 16 CPUs, whatever. And there was a warning, yellow bag on that system that you could clean with the touch of a button. The problem is that there were 2 buttons on that machine. One was for cleaning the log, and cleaning the yellow bank, the warning, and the other one was for rebooting the machine. So the customer was upset with the yellow bank thing and asked me, which one is the one that cleared the logs? And I thought, I think it's the one on the right, but I need to check. He didn't wait. He go and pressed the button. 30 seconds later, someone came in and said, did something happen in production? I knew that he was pressing the wrong button, right? So hallucinations happens in every place. Can you trust the pipeline? Can you trust a test, right? At the end of the day, it's all about the controls and the mitigation that you have. If you go back to the VM thing that I was alluding to, a lot of customers see the opportunity to optimize the infrastructure. And for them, the risk of the hypervisor introducing a bug was small, so they just use it. Other customers were more conscious, and they decided to use it just in test and dev, and not in production, for example, right? Fast forward 20 years, if you're not using a VM, you get the look, right? I mean, why are you not using VMs? I mean, it becomes the obvious way to do things, right? So this may be a little bit of an extreme statement, but why do we think that generative AI cannot fail? Everything is failing, right? And as I said, it's just a matter of how you approach that failure, how you mitigate that failure. Be aware of the risk associated to a potential failure. Most of the time, I think that this is a mindset problem, right? I see a lot of people coming into this as this is not entirely correct, right? I think that a better mindset to approach this thing is, did it help me saving time, right? That's kind of the only metric that counts here, right? If it's not entirely correct, but it helped me saving 90% of the time, of course it's been useful, right? While not being correct, right? So I think that there is a lot of things that we need to think about. Are they going to replace us is another common theme that we keep hearing. And of course, it ties back to the, can you trust them, right? One of the tweets that I like the most is this one that says, I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, right? Which is the essence of the, we want to remove undifferentiated heavy lifting. That's kind of how you think about that, right? And again, because I'm weird in the way that I think about stuff, I was thinking, can this be just another layer of abstraction, right? So think about what happened in the infrastructure as code space. In the infrastructure as code space, we have seen a lot of these abstractions over time. Many years ago, we started with the CloudFormation template. The way that you would describe your AWS infrastructure is through CloudFormation, right? Which maybe to deploy a Fargate service with a load balancer would take maybe 1,000 lines of infrastructure as code. Then we moved to CDK, right? Where in, 20 lines of CDK code, you can use a construct that deploys a Fargate with a load balancer in front of it. What if this is just another layer of abstraction where you can ask your assistant, create a CDK program that deploys a Fargate task behind the load balancer or something like that? It's probably just going to be another layer of abstraction available to you to simplify all of these things. So again, the way that and this is, I think, the last slide, the way that I think about this is, imagine that these are two lines that describe the developer knowledge. I'm just going to switch to this one because I've been staying there forever. Imagine that this describes the developer knowledge, right? And this describes the complexity of the task at scale. And you sit here, right, as a developer. You kind of had this knowledge, right? And that defines where you are in control and where you are out of control, right? Everything that happens on the right-hand side is kind of out of control because you don't know that part, right? But everything that happens on the left-hand side, you kind of know, right? The other thing is that the other dimension, which is in friction, right? It's like on the left-hand side, that part is low return. On the other side is high return. Imagine if you can prompt, like, build me an OS from scratch. Probably you are completely out of control, but that would be high return, right? Because you get an OS basically just out of a prompt. So the way that I think about this thing is that where you want to be is in this boost zone, right? Where you use the generative AI assistant to take work that you are in control of, right? But you want to save time by not having to do that work, right? There is another opportunity, which is what I call the learning zone, where you ask to do things that you are slightly less in control, but it's like a learning mechanism. You can learn by the generative AI assistant giving you hints about how to do certain things. Easy also to kind of verify. Where you probably don't want to be is in this space, right? That's the danger zone. That's the write me a new CRM from scratch because I want to compete with SAP, right? Without knowing anything about CRMs. That's kind of the danger zone. And this other one, there is this other limited value zone, right? Maybe you don't need to use a generative AI assistant to ask it, how do I set a variable, right? Or weird things like that, right? So basically, you want to be in this area here to get like the best and mitigate all the risks that we have been talking about. So in conclusion, this is the last slide, right? My suggestion is to keep an open mind, right? What we see people doing is kind of having an approach that is either, right or wrong, right? And my point is that proving this technology to be wrong is incredibly easy, right? If you want to go on Twitter and go viral, I mean, yeah, you can trick these systems very easily, right? And you get your 30 seconds of fame on Twitter because you will be able to trick them. But I think that the real challenge is trying to extract value from these tools because they can be very useful. The usual anecdote that I usually use is, you can rent a car, right? You can rent a car and go to the beach or drive it into a wall. You can do both with this generative AI assistant, and I think that you want to go to the beach, right? Instead of proving that you can drive it into a wall. Because yes, you can drive it into a wall, but you can also go to the beach. That's kind of the final one. That is like a barcode for generic feedback, not for this session. Emre and the team has a feedback for this session. So if you want to tell us something, us being AWS, about things that you want to see, that you don't want to see, or you want us to do better, use that barcode to provide that feedback. Again, this is different from the feedback for the event. And these are my contacts if you want to get in touch. I don't know how I did with timing. I may screwed it. I don't know. I'm sorry if I did. But that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So we have a few minutes left. If you have any questions. Sorusu olan var mı? Birkaç dakikamız var. Evet. Geliyor. Mikrofon geliyor. Do you want to take this? Okay, you have.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. At some slide you said same objections were made to VMs in 2000s, right? Or similar ones. So in my opinion, VMs are deterministic systems, but I don't see that in Gen AI applications. Do you have any predictions or any solutions to that? Thank you.
I'm not sure I got the question. I understood that you About the comparison to the VMs?
Yes, yes. So my question is actually, the VMs and hypervisors are deterministic applications. They work how we code them, but generative AI is actually hallucinating, and that's the main problem we are having today, right? So how can we address this issue? Like, how can we compare it to VM or hypervisor
Yeah.
programs?
Yeah, I mean, the VMware hypervisor comparison was maybe a stretch in terms of the comparison. These are two completely different domains. The main point that I was trying to make was more generic. Like, every time there is a transition, and it happened with cloud as well, right? It happened with cloud. It happened with Linux, right? The transition, I mean, a lot of you, as I said, are very young people, so do not remember all of these things, but there was a big discussion in terms of the transition from Windows to Linux, from on-prem to cloud. All of these transitions basically are governed by this notion of, is there like an advantage, right? Is there a piece of thing in that new thing that I cannot live without, that can trade off some of the risks and some of the fears that I have in moving there? And I'll give you an example that has proven to be the answer to be no, right, to that question. Like, think about OpenStack, right? Think about, that's my personal opinion, Web3. All of this technology where people would need to transition into this new thing, but they saw the obvious risk of doing that because a transition always brings like the associated risk and additional work and whatever, but they didn't see the big value. So do not like hang up too much on that VM hypervisor thing. That was just an example. Think about more holistically about, is it worth making this transition? And my point is that for generative AI, it is worth making this transition, and all the problems associated to it will be solved or mitigated over time. In the VM space, it was not just about the bug. It was also about licenses, right? Big problem for a big organization, right? People did not know how to license software inside the VMs. Do I license the VM? Do I license the large system? If I have many applications using that large system, my license cost is going to explode. All of those things got resolved over time because basically people said, nope, this is the transition that we're going to make, so you fix that problem. That problem is not going to stuck us there, right? So that's kind of how I would think about this. There was another question over there.
Yeah, just one more question, then.
Hey, okay. So my question is about generative AI is nowadays strictly into the large language models, and I'm looking for possibilities for future career perspectives for the other parts of generative AI, such as vision models, maybe for the sound models as well. So do you see any, let's say, customer or client problems related to these fields instead of language models? Because all your presentation was about understanding and reasoning by the language, but what about the vision, for example?
Oh, yeah. This is part of the first slide, the disclaimer that I put up. There is a lot of use cases that are coming from other model. Like, I've been focusing 100% on these text to text, basically, right? So English to code, code to English, whatever, but very much into the text. There are a lot of use cases that generative AI in general is very cool. I can tell you about an example that still lives in this domain, but it leads into this visual thing. There has been prototype that the internal teams at AWS has been building, especially from solutions architect TAMs, where they are using Bedrock generative AI to take sketches of whiteboard exercises with customers, right? Imagine that you have a 1 hour long session with a customer where you brainstorm about an architecture on a whiteboard, right? And you get this complex architecture. Imagine taking a screenshot of that whiteboard session, giving it to an LLM and say, build me infrastructure as code for this cached architecture, right? So we're not leaking into these, generative AI is disrupting Hollywood kind of thing that I was alluding to, but even in our space, even in my space, which is kind of very niche compared to everything, we are already seeing some of these visual, not sound too much, but visual for sure. Yep. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you, Massimo, again. So we will have just very quick sponsor presentations. Accenture.
Merhaba, herkese hoş geldin diyorum. Accenture bilmeyenler için en son baktığımda 700 bin çalışanı olan bir yazılım devi. Biz de Türkiye'de Accenture yazılım evi olarak yaklaşık 300 tane mühendisle bu alanda çalışıyoruz. Tabii bu gördüğümüz teknolojileri aslında gerçek müşterilere ulaştırmak bizim temel hedefimiz. Ağırlıklı olarak yurt dışı müşterilerine çalışıyoruz ve teknolojik olarak da son derece enteresan projeler yapıyoruz. Yaklaşık 20 yıldır bu sektördeyim ve de gerek AWS'le gerek diğer partnerimizle hep global projeler yaptık. Bugün de burada enteresan bir standımız var. Arkadaşlarımız sizin için hazırladı. Onlara da çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bu eventin gerçekleşmesinde de emeği geçen herkese çok teşekkür ediyorum. Sağ olun.
Teşekkür ederiz. Çok teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi Adesso. Buyur.
Selamlar, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Fırat Yaşar ben. Adesso'da Cloud ve DevOps tarafında Engineering Head olarak görev yapıyorum. Çok kısa Adesso hakkında bilgi vereceğim. 550 kişilik Türkiye'de bir yazılım eviyiz. Lokal ve global yazılım projeleri yapıyoruz. Daha çok yazılım ihraç ediyoruz diyebilirim. Bu 550 kişi içerisinde 40 kişilik bir Cloud ve DevOps takımımız var. Yazılım olarak aslında yazılım yaklaşımı olarak Cloud Native olarak yazılım geliştiriyoruz. Dolayısıyla DevOps mindset'ini bu Cloud Native yazılım geliştirme süreçleri etrafına konumlandırıyoruz. Ve Cloud bizim için çok değerli. O yüzden AWS ile advanced seviyede bir partnership'liğimiz bulunuyor global olarak. Ve şu anda neredeyse 90'a yakın projeyi eş zamanlı olarak deliver ediyoruz. Gün boyu standta olacağız. Bilgi almak isterseniz, tanışmak isterseniz beklerim. Umarım herkes için güzel bir etkinlik olur. Teşekkürler.
Teşekkür ederiz. Arkadaşlar birkaç güzel sunumumuz da var. Şu EPAM'ın videosu var. Hemen onu açacağım. Daha sonra Logitech'in güzel bir konuşması olacak.
Welcome to EPAM. Would you like to engineer the future with impactful projects? Transforming the digital landscape? We work to deliver the most creative and cutting-edge solutions for our clients worldwide. We're a global, diverse, and creative IT community that thinks big and inspires one another. We discover new skills, learn from mentors, and connect with colleagues worldwide. We lead socially responsible, educational, and environmental community initiatives that make the world a better place. We embrace and welcome everyone, creating a place where everyone can be themselves and be different. Here, you can work from where you want and enjoy a flexible work-life balance. Join our team at EPAM Türkiye and find inspiration to create the technology of the future while living your best life. Engineer your career with us.
EPAM'a da çok teşekkürler. Şimdi Logitech'i davet ediyorum buraya.
Merhaba herkese. Aslında kalabalığı biraz kaybettik ama yapacak bir şey yok. İsmim Cihan Önal. Ben Logitech Türkiye kategori ve pazarlama lideriyim. Aslında son dönemde Massimo'nun da speech'inde gördüğümüz gibi yapay zeka odak noktasında. Biz de Logitech olarak bir ekipman firması olmamıza rağmen bu alanda yatırımlar yapıyoruz. Bugün dışarıda standta görebileceğiniz üzere MX serisiyle buradayız. MX serisi bizim özellikle yazılımcıların ve tasarımcıların kullandığı serimiz. Ve bugün burada MX serisine katılan yeni üyemiz MX Brio web kameramızı tanıtıyoruz. Bu kamera Logitech'in çıkardığı en yeni ve en üstün web kamerası aslında. 8,5 megapiksellik Sony Starvis sensörü kullanıyor. Ayrıca 30 FPS'te Ultra HD 4K çözünürlük sunuyor. Ama daha da ilgi çekici kısmı aslında bütün konuşmalarda değinilen yapay zekayı bu ürünün de kullanıyor olması. Görüntü iyileştirme özelliğiyle yüzün konumunu algılıyor. Beyaz dengesi, pozlama ve odaklamayı otomatik olarak ayarlıyor. Ayrıca entegre mikrofonlarıyla gürültü önleyici özelliği yine yapay zekayı kullanarak yapıyor. Eğitimciler için kamera aşağı doğru eğildiğinde otomatik rotasyonunu gerçekleştiriyor. Ve masanızdaki notları ve objeleri rahatlıkla karşı tarafa aktarabiliyorsunuz. Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Webex, Skype, FaceTime gibi yazılımlarla uyumlu bir şekilde çalışıyor. Bir de bizim ürünlerimizin sürdürülebilirlik ana odak noktalarından bir tanesi, ürünlerimizde en az %75 oranında geri dönüştürülmüş plastik kullanılıyor. Bir de paylaşmak istediğim yazılım konusu var. Logitech yazılım alanında da ciddi bir şekilde yatırım yapıyor. Ücretsiz olarak sunulan Logi Options Plus yazılımımızla özellikle yeni lansmanını yaptığımız MX Brio kameramızdaki renk tonu, canlılık, görüş alanı gibi ayarlamaları yapabiliyorsunuz. Ayrıca MX Brio haricinde MX Mouse ve klavyelerimiz aracılığıyla da tuşlarınıza makro atamaları yapabiliyorsunuz. Yine Smart Actions adını verdiğimiz akıllı eylemlerle tekrarladığınız işleri aslında otomatikleştirebiliyorsunuz. Bunu da kullanmanızı öneririm açıkçası. Bir de birkaç hafta önce yeni bir özellik daha tanıttık. Bu da Logi AI Prompt Builder. Bu aslında bilgisayar başında çok vakit geçiren insanlar için çok faydalı bir özellik. Mouse ve klavyelerinize atadığınız tek bir tuş ile ChatGPT'ye otomatik bağlanıyorsunuz. Ve bunun için yeni bir browser açmanıza da gerek kalmıyor. Tüm bu inovasyonları aslında yerinde incelemek için sizi standa davet ediyoruz. Ekip zaten paylaştı. 4 farklı ürünümüzü bugün çekilişle vereceğiz. Ama onun haricinde bugün Amazon'un MX ürünlerinde çok ciddi indirimleri var. Eğer bir ürün alacaksanız bugün almanızı çok öneririz. Standa gelen bir arkadaş 2 gün önce verdiği siparişteki ürünün fiyatı daha yüksek olduğu için iptal edip yenisini verdi şu an. O yüzden MX ürünlerine bakmanızı öneririz Amazon'da bugün. Fırsatları değerlendirmenizi şiddetle tavsiye ediyoruz. Bizi dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkürler. Keyifli bir gün diliyoruz.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi şöyle, zaten akşam çekilişte de bir sürü Logitech ürünü vereceğiz. Orada da yine bu şeyden bahsederiz, olur mu? Amazon fırsatından. Biraz azaldı. Full salon olur akşam zaten. Orada mutlaka bahsedelim. Gerçekten fırsatı kaçırmak istemeyebilirler insanlar. App Circle'dan biri var mıydı? App Circle'dan birisi şu an burada yok. Şöyle gösterelim. Onlar da Mobile DevOps platformu. Standlarına uğrayabilirsiniz yine. Parni'den birisi var mıydı şu an? Parni'yi de ben yine söyleyebilirim. Parni'nin de standı var yine. Onlar da çekiliş yapıyor. Bakabilirsiniz. Parni'de de on-call management ürünü yapıyorlar. Alerting ürünü. DevOps ekiplerinin özellikle ilgilenebileceği bir ürün. Kısaca böyle arkadaşlar. Şimdi araya çıkıyoruz. Yarım saat bir kahve molamız var. Daha sonra 2 salonda paralel olarak trackler devam edecek.